Hello, I'm Barb Sommer, and I'm sitting with George Fales today. It's June 7th, 2011, and we're doing an oral visual history interview for the Commission of Deaf, Deafblind, and Hard of Hearing Minnesotans Oral Visual History Project. We're in the Golden Rule Building in downtown St. Paul, Minnesota. So thank you, George, for coming in today. And would you like to say your name and tell me a little bit about your activism?
Okay, Barb, I'm George Fales, and I'm a native St. Paulite. Lived here just about all of my life except the couple years when I was working out of the state. I'm what you classified as a deaf-blind person, but I'm an English-speaking person. I do not use ASL or American Sign Language. I started out with a mild hearing loss in my youth, and then gravitated to wearing hearing aids during my high school years. Then also in college. And over the years, my vision started to diminish due to retinitis pigmentosa, which is a genetic inheritance type problem, and sometimes it's associated with various degrees of hearing loss, and it's normally called Usher syndrome, and there's, like everything else, there's various degrees of hearing loss and sight loss. Over the years, I got involved with the blindness system and the organization for the blind, and then in peer counseling work for the vision loss resources in St. Paul and Minneapolis, in peer counseling work. And in doing this work, I came across many seniors much older than myself at the time that had hearing impairment and were suffering from macular degeneration, which is just the opposite type of a sight loss that I have. And I found that this group of people were not being served very well back in those years. And so I gradually became acquainted with some of the people that had started the Minnesota Deaf-Blind Services. And it led me into meeting up with the Kurt Micka, who was a policymaker for the Division of Deaf and Hard of Hearing. And I then got involved in the governor's office on assistive technology for the disabled. And through that agency, I was working with some deaf people, and it dawned on me at that time that there was a real need for services, policy-wise and even politically wise. And so I got involved with a task force. I thought it was ironic that these people without hearing aids were becoming reclusive, and it affected their mental outlook. And I felt strongly that this sort of a thing had to be corrected. So that's generally, Barb, how I got into dealing with the deaf and hard of hearing and the deaf-blind community.
And you said that you, at that time, tell us a little bit about that time and what was going on generally in the deaf and deaf-blind community.
Okay.
And when it was, when you're talking about.
Well, it was about it's just about 1989, 1990, when I met a young woman who was a strong advocate for the deafblind. She herself was, at that time, had functional sight and maybe more of a serious hearing loss than I had. And this was through a support group called Vanishing Visions. It was a support group that worked with people who were having the same type of eye problems that as retinitis pigmentosa, and in some cases with the macular degeneration. That was predominantly occurring among the older people. Well, in this support group, I learned from this young woman. Her name was, the name escapes me just for the moment, but anyway, she was such an advocate working with deafblind consumers for Intosh Incorporated, which was a private service organization for the deafblind. And so I learned pretty much about some of the needs of these people through her. Her name was Kathy Anderson, and she was one of the early pioneers in starting up Intosh Incorporated. So through that experience, I got involved with the Division of Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services through Kurt Mickel and Mary Hartnett.
Well, you said Intosh Incorporated? Is that what you said?
Intosh?
Intosh Incorporated. Okay.
Right.
Is that a private or?
Yes. In fact, I think it was a result of the fact that because of the state funding had to be cut off for the deaf blind services of Minnesota, which was a nonprofit, tax-exempt organization that started up, and after a few years, they no longer could provide that service, and then the deafblind community, along with the help of people like Mary Hartnett and Kathy Anderson and others, they started up the private nonprofit organization, which was the first one that's iron inserted in the United States. And this was to provide rehab training for the deafblind.
And so that it was one of the first ones in the country, or the first one in the United States, as far as you're aware?
Yes, I might have to stand corrected in one aspect. There was an organization in Seattle, Washington, that pioneered in the deafblind community. There was a group of, I believe you call them Cajuns from Louisiana, that among these French community, they had a large number of people who had Usher syndrome, which is a combination of hearing and sight loss. And I'm not exactly sure when this company started in Seattle, but I believe that Intosh Incorporated could have been the first private organization to provide rehab services for this group. They did get some funding from State Services for the Blind, who were not really equipped to give the highly detailed training that they needed for people who could not speak English and had to learn Braille. And so it was picked up later by the Minneapolis Society for the Blind, where a few people with the Usher syndrome were being rehabbed.
And that was that the start of a deaf-blind, working with deaf-blind community then, or was that more focused on the blind community?
Well, Barbara, at that time, they didn't, shall I say, have a community among themselves yet. The deaf-blind, let's see, the Minnesota Deaf-Blind Association was started by a group of deaf-blind people who felt that they needed to serve themselves as well as being provided rehab training by the Minneapolis Society for the Blind or the State Services for the Blind. And their mission, when they started back in June of 1961, was to provide advocacy, support, and even provide some services that they felt that they could do better among themselves for other deaf-blind people. And so today, the Minnesota Deaf-Blind Association is a thriving nonprofit organization of their own. In other words, they do not depend upon outside agencies other than having interpreters at their board meetings or forums or any outings that they provide for these people to get them out and be involved with the community.
1961, you said? Was that pretty early?
Yes, as far as I was concerned, it was in a way, because I really sort of gravitated into the working with the deaf-blind people later after that organization started up, and I knew nothing of it at that time. Frankly, my main concern in those earlier years was my sight problem. I was in a career that where my vision was still functional and very helpful in the earlier years, but as the vision became less and less diminished, in other words, with retinitis pigmentosa, you are classified as being legally blind if your peripheral vision is 18% or less, and or if you with the corrections of glasses or any other devices, and the problem, I knew I had this problem. It was first detected back when I was about 19 years old, but it was very light. It was very difficult for the ophthalmologist to really detect it, but they suspected it. And one other indicator of this type of a problem is that you have night vision problems. In my case, I did not. I was able to see well at night, even though they were able to later to detect some diminution of the peripheral vision, but it did not affect my functional activities. And so it wasn't, as I say, during my working years from when I started as an agronomist for Stanix Incorporated in 1955, I was able to drive and pretty much from the Great Lakes out to Montana in my work. So, but in later years, along about 1964, my peripheral vision did start to diminish to the point where it did affect my driving to a certain degree. However, I did continue to drive, and then I became legally blind in 1970 when my peripheral vision did drop below 18% from one side to the other. So at that time, while I did wear in-the-ear hearing aids, it was I only used one. I was not having too much difficulty, and my main concern was my sight. And so I believe that I did not have this Usher syndrome, which is comes in various degrees of loss. My hearing loss in the earlier years, as I mentioned, was very mild, but it got progressively worse as I aged. And so it really wasn't until about 1985 when I really started to have powerful hearing aids and wear 2 hearing aids most of the time. That was about the time when I started to get acquainted pretty much with the other people in the deafblind community.
And so you said you found these people, you found them through Intosh, and that's kind of your entry into meeting people in the deafblind community? Was that how that?
That is correct. And Kathy Anderson was known of the severity of the problems that these people were having when she was working with them, teaching them how to use a computer. She made me aware of what potentially she and myself would be facing, and so she more or less encouraged me to be ready and to think about ahead and use every communication devices I possibly can so that I could keep in contact with the outside world if I had complete sight loss or hearing loss.
So you were starting to train yourself. Is that when you started learning more about the needs of the deafblind community then?
Yes.
And as you said?
Right.
So you started kind of, what made you start to think about the needs of others?
I suspect that going back to vision loss resources, where I had my earlier rehab training for preparation for blindness, in 1983, I got involved with peer counseling work. And that's where people who have been blind for some time and had rehab training will start calling on newly blind people and help them bridge the gap to learn from their, mostly by listening. We try to be listeners of their problems and step in when we had to help with ideas or encouragement and so forth. And at that time, after visiting with Kathy Anderson and others, and seeing how the seniors were becoming reclusive because of some hearing loss and sight problems, I felt compelled to become more aggressive in working with this community. When I had the opportunity to be a part of the Minnesota Senior Federation, I took it upon myself to, because I did a lot of writing in my working career years, to write articles in the Senior Federation newspaper that traveled throughout the whole state of Minnesota about services that to help the deaf, and also some articles about dealing with slowly diminishing sight loss.
And so you were looking at trying to help educate people so that they could, and also help them bridge the changes they were going through.
Would you repeat that, please?
To help bridge the, or may help them navigate, help people navigate change.
Yes,
in their
that's
lives.
right. I found it very rewarding. It gave me a sense of well-being in helping other people, and because I had done a lot of educational work after leaving the university and starting to work in the at Cenex and cooperative movement, there was a lot of education work involved, and that sort of carried over after in my retirement years. And so I took it upon myself to have at least, they encouraged us to have maybe 3 to 4 clients to call on a few times each month and give a report of what you think their progress is, and sometimes to be ready to call in a community service person when they might be ready to be served by State Services for the Blind.
So you were a good listener.
Yes, we had to take a 10 weeks, 5 hours per class sessions on listening skills, to learn to find their hidden fears, to not to push them too quickly into something that they're not ready for, but to try to gently pass on your own experiences wherever it was called for. So the listening skills was very important in peer counseling work.
How long are you still involved in that?
I retired from active volunteer work as a peer counseling after, let's see, I started back in about 82 and did that work until about 2000, the year 2000. But I also was involved in several other activities as one which I considered very important, and since I was quite actively involved in the blindness system with State Services for the Blind, they asked me to serve on some advisory committees, and among those committees was the DeafBlind services. But that wasn't until probably around 2004 when I got involved with that part of it. I also was working with the Minnesota chapter of the American Council of the Blind on their board, and also serving with the Senior Federation board. So through all these different agencies, I was able to, pass on some of my experiences that Kathy Anderson was telling me about. And there's, of course, one thing I need to point out. Among sensory loss, people along the way are not aware that sometimes these sensory loss are occurring. For example, it seems strange, but there's a lot of people with slowly diminishing sight loss aren't really aware that it's happening until someone points it out to them. And sometimes I think it's pretty well known that there's many people that have hearing loss but don't really admit to it. It seems that hearing loss is something that people want to hide more than sight loss.
Yeah, we see that, or I noticed that people sometimes don't want to admit, especially to a hearing loss.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you've mentioned the Minnesota Senior Federation.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to talk a little bit about your work with that and what kinds of things you did with it?
Well, when I got involved with some of the people at that time were much older than myself, who had started with using computers but were complaining about having problems really seeing their monitors as well as they used to, it occurred to me that maybe State Services for the Blind or some agency should be working to help these people who already know how to use computers and are connected up with the outside world to teach them how to use adaptive software, like we call it JAWS or Window Eyes, that converts text to speech. So it's a screen reader that voices out everything that's on that monitor. And in working with some of these senior members of the board that had computer use, but were complaining about not seeing well, I told them about this software because I had been using it for since 1990, when again, going back to Kathy Anderson, she helped me get started with the first software that read not Windows. It didn't use Windows as such. It would read WordPerfect, and so I was able to continue to do some writing by being able at that time to see some of the enlarged words on the monitor as well as hear the words, which helped in the training. So I tried to convince some of these people that this is something that we needed, and I didn't realize at the time that they were starting to do that with the deaf blind people by using a Braille keypad that at the bottom of the regular keyboard. And that there's a software that converts text over into Braille, and the deaf-blind person can actually run their fingers over the Braille keyboard that would pop up with the proper cells for each letter, and they could read it just like they were reading a Braille book. So through the Senior Federation, we got a grant written up and tried to, and then State Services for the Blind was going to join with me in a partnership, and we were going to see if we can get some public support, but that took quite a while. And besides, along with that effort to get started in providing tutorial training for the seniors that use computers, I did quite a bit of writing of articles for the senior newspaper because there were a few board members that wore hearing aids, and I just felt that we needed to get the word out. And as a result of that, we did get the head person of the Minnesota Academy of Audiologists together, and to explore the possibility of the Senior Federation providing some type of service among their other services, low-cost audiology services for hearing throughout the state of Minnesota. And the Academy of Audiologists for Minnesota did have a manager that more or less helped them to get the word out. And so that was one thing that we started out with, along with the articles on the various types of hearing loss, the availability of all the different types of hearing assistive equipment, and so on.
And so how did you reached people through the newsletter and through education to try to make sure people understood that these services were available and how to help find them then?
Yeah, we, if I understood your question right, Barb, you were wondering about how did it get going? Is it this started?
Yes.
Okay. In working closely with State Services for the Blind, I suggested to them that the libraries are a good repository for all types of books and things that people need for education, and that possibly they might be a good place to have some of the equipment, computers with the adapted software to help people that come into the library that might want to read about certain things. And it was possible to take a book and lay it on a scanner, and that scanner is equipped with an optical character recognition software, just like a copying machine, and then it converts that text over to speech, and it also can be enlarged on the monitor so that a person with low vision could easily read a monitor and see the book, just like an ordinary person reading with normal vision. Well, when we got the librarians together at two different meetings, the Hennepin County library system was very quick to jump on the utilization of JAWS, which is one of the software that converts word to speech, and installed it in their one of the first libraries, I believe, out at in the western side of Minneapolis. And then after they trained some of the librarians in how to do some basic tutorial training of the use of this equipment, we had a couple more meetings, and the St. Paul representative for the development of library services and the friends of the library became acquainted with it, and we provided them with the grant proposals that the Senior Federation helped me develop to try and get money from other sources to install the computers at their library. So today they have one in the Highland Park Library and one in the one of the what they call the Job Workforce Center library in St. Paul on Dale and University Avenue. And as a result of this, the Hudson family gave some money to the Minneapolis let's see, what do I want to call it? The Minneapolis Foundation to fund what they called digital inclusion. And from that, the main library in downtown Minneapolis has several computers all equipped with this type of software, and they were able to, with the funding from this digital inclusion fund, able to hire some visually impaired computer users who have been long-time users of all these softwares to be able to do tutorial work for anybody that came into that library. And so today they hold 2 and 3 hours programs training on specific applications of Windows.
Okay, George, when we just talked a little bit about some of the difficulties that the Services for the Blind and the Division for the Blind felt in working with deaf-blind people. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yes. Once, while we had people like Lynette Boyer on this advisory committee, along with some other hard of hearing blind people and myself, we had to explore models that were being provided by other states on working with deaf-blind. And it's hard to believe that many other states' services had problems in trying to bring the two together, because there was a Kentucky model that we studied where the resource people from their division for the deaf, and then counselors from the services for the blind would work together and provide whatever services they could. But oftentimes the two services would clash with one another, because one would want to demand more time in helping to rehab a blind person, while the deaf person or the hearing impaired person may be having trouble hearing about the rehab side of it. And so this came up quite vividly in our advisory committee meetings, and the Division for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing was trying to take care of the deaf person with their services, and then possibly, depending on the degree of sight loss, then maybe the blind service counselor would come in. They did try, and I believe it might still be going, for the deaf blind person that had received some rehab training from the Deaf Blind Services of Minnesota, which is a part of Vision Loss Resources in Minneapolis, would provide the rehab training for the deaf and blind person. They found that maybe not all of these people with the various degrees of hearing loss and sight loss might be able to work out their own program. And so they started what they called a discretionary self-service type program, and they probably took the money that they would possibly would pay to the blind counselor for his or her time, and for the deaf counselor to give to this person with various degrees of sight and hearing loss to spend the money the way they felt best. In other words, if they were having more visual problems than they were having hearing problems, they possibly would use more of that money towards services from state services. And then if they, on the other hand, were had some rehab training from state services, but were having very serious hearing problems, then maybe they would apply for the tutorial training on using the computer and the software to fit their specific needs. And it's sort of like maybe working with an HMO with your own self-styled health plan. And I think this is working out quite well for some of the people. I know in my case, if that were available, I would use most of it at that time, in the earlier years, for sight rehab training, and then possibly deal with the hearing problem later when, as I aged, became more worse.
Did that lead to your work, or was that part of the work with the legislative group that you were involved with?
Yes, Barb, it was. As I mentioned earlier, I became acquainted with Kurt Micka while I was on the advisory committee on assisted technology for the disabled, normally called the STAR program. There were a couple people in that advisory group that were also hearing impaired, and it turned out that Kurt was working on the idea of really on two different things now. One was to try to get the mandated benefits of providing hearing aids for the anybody that was on the health plan. Well, the long and short of that is I was able to persuade Senator Richard Cohen to carry a bill to get this mandated benefit for health care from the health care agencies. And the long and short of that was that there was a lot of resistance from these healthcare providers to absorb the cost of providing hearing aids, which were creeping up and very much in cost, $2,000 to $2,500 and even $3,000 a piece. And but since it was so important for hearing impaired children to, in their developmental years and for education, to have some type of corrective hearing equipment, we were able to get the legislators to go along with that part of it, and that was definitely carried out by the efforts of all the people associated with the Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing when they had legislative rallies and so forth. The Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing and the DeafBlind were instrumental in pulling these people together to help get the mandated hearing aid for children up to the age of, I believe, 18 or 21. The other aspect of the task force was when they felt that it was necessary in the Department of Human Services to present a total viewpoint, overview of the needs of the deafblind. So Kurt arranged to have many deafblind people and people like myself at the task force to work over several months on bringing out the barriers to the deafblind and ways to overcome these barriers. And that was, after several months, it was all compiled and documented and then presented to the legislative body as a booklet. And I might want to give credit to another young woman by the name of Adrienne Hagen from Olivia, Minnesota. There was a woman that, like myself, had early stages of retinitis pigmentosa, I believe, and probably a little bit more severe hearing loss, that was very active in this task force and helped chair the meeting because she was associated with the Minnesota Deaf-Blind Association, sort of a self-help group that I mentioned about earlier, along with Lynette Boyer, who was a pioneer in developing the Minnesota Deaf-Blind Association. So the long and short of it is that not only the task force pulled together with the help of the Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, the self-help type group of the Minnesota Deaf-Blind Association helped develop this book that was presented to the legislative body.
And how did the legislative body receive it then?
Well, I think along with the efforts of the Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing and the Deaf-Blind at legislative rallies and by the people advocating for themselves, have convinced the legislative body that this community of people were being involved with a lot of barriers, and that they should do anything that they can to help eliminate some of these barriers. and of course the commission being the focal point for these people to gather together and use their advocacy efforts, and working with Senator Richard Cohen, I think this brought about some of the services that they needed. There's still a lot of work to be done. I mean, there's much work that needs to be done by the deaf only, but these people as a community need to realize too that as they age, they are going to experience many of the problems that the totally deaf and the blind people have. So it behooves both the deaf and the blind to work together on some of these issues.
Will you just talk a little bit about the Minnesota Deaf-Blind Association and your work with that? Or
yes. I took it upon myself, I think about after Lynette Boyer told me at one of the task force meetings about the Deaf-Blind Association, I went to one of the board meetings just to learn how they conducted the board meetings, what kind of work they did, and what their mission was. And I learned that they had to have American Sign Language interpreters there, and they had both the deaf, blind, English-speaking people like myself on this board, and we planned outings and forums, meeting forums for them. Among some of the meetings, for example, is we met with the Minneapolis Police Department, who fortunately had a woman American Sign Language interpreter as an officer, and she had worked with the young deaf-blind people like Jessica and Rachel Eggert, who were members of the Minnesota Deaf-Blind Association, and she would bring in another officer who was not aware of the needs of the deaf-blind, and he was to learn of their needs if an emergency came up. And out of this came a seminar for the deaf-blind on how to prepare for emergencies, whether it's a weather emergency or maybe a burglary in their home or the apartment or whatever. How to prepare and how to communicate with an officer who may not know that they're deaf-blind. We try to tell them to be sure and inform the safety officers and everybody where they lived and what their needs were and so forth. Some of them were maybe having a reflectorized little metal put on the window of whether there's an apartment or a home and the bedroom where they sleep, so that if there is a fire, the fire department will know that there's a disabled person in that particular room. Also to carry a card in their wallet or purse, so that if for any reason that they are riding with someone and their car gets stopped for some violation, they will have that card to show the officer that they're deafblind and that they're, you know, not been drinking or anything like that, and that so that the driver, of course, who, if there was any violation, would have to explain the situation. But it was mainly for home use, so that when an officer comes, they will see this card or any other type of literature to indicate that that person was deafblind. Then there was outings. We would have picnic outings, and I helped sponsor the picnic for the first time in St. Paul in the Hidden Falls area. They've had a couple over in the Minneapolis side at the their park, but it wasn't quite as convenient as the St. Paul one, where the Metro Mobility could bring them right up to the picnic area under cover and so forth. We would try to arrange to have outdoor activities, such as last fall they had a camping outing up at Camp, I believe Courage. I myself didn't go, but it was up in the Brainerd area on Sylvan Lake, and they spent a weekend up there. Though we like to try and have these people get out into the community as much as possible, so that the community knows about their situation and their needs, and also for the deafblind person to be able to meld in with the community and maybe somehow serve them as the blind person serves in peer counseling work and so on.
You have done quite a bit, and we're only touching the surface, I think, of the volunteer and advocacy that you've done. But I know that you won a McKnight award, is that correct? Tell us a little bit about winning the award.
Well, as it turned out, the executive director, Peter Wyckoff, a longtime head of the Senior Federation, knew of the grant writing that we were providing to try and get money for tutorial help. Knew about the Virginia McKnight Bringer Award, and he had the volunteer coordinator who I was most associated with to get 3 other people to nominate me, and among them was the peer counselor supervisor of vision loss resources, and someone from State Services for the Blind besides Peter Wyckoff, to submit my nomination. And I was surprised. I really didn't know about it. I guess they're not supposed to notify who their nominee or the nominee that they're submitting their name, and it didn't come until the notice until about October, and that when the writer hired by the McKnight Foundation to document some of the information was the first time I learned about it, and that was in October. And of course the nomination or the dinner was held at the Heritage Center out at the in the I'm trying to remember the name, but it was out in the northeast part of Minneapolis, where they have at least 10 other nominees that receive awards for whatever efforts that they were working on, and we were invited to bring along at least 9 or 10 other members at each dinner table, and we received a beautiful cut glass star with the name inscribed, and then also they gave us a little financial reward for our efforts. So I'm glad that out of all of this, that the St. Paul and Minneapolis Library now are carrying out the tutorial work that we started.
As you've looked back and you've talked about things that have happened, but as you look forward, what is it that you would like to see happen more for the blind community, the deaf and the deaf-blind community?
Well, for one, in the deaf, in the state services for the blind, there was a time when, and what they are facing right now, but back a while, their funding had to be cut back, and the advisory council of the blind, which is commissioned by the governor, and it's made up of members from various blind organizations and so forth, had to make a decision on how to divide what money they had left to services to, say, the deaf-blind community and just the blind community. And it was the first time that they ever had to have what they call a service review. And it was interesting that the strictly blind person with very good hearing all voted to give top priority to the deaf-blind community because they felt that their needs were far more important than their own. And now I believe this situation is occurring again, but frankly, I have to say at the moment I do not know what the status of that service is going to be, if we are going to just give discretionary money to the deaf-blind person, or if they will provide just rehab training for them as top priority, and then the balance of the funding to the blind people. That is one of the critical needs, I think, is looming, because there are a lot of deaf-blind people out state. And just to back up a bit, in my travel, I worked a lot with farm families, and it seems odd in a way, but in the rural area, families with a disabled person, especially one that might be deaf-blind, tend to protect them, hold them back, tend to, in a way, hide them, like it was a curse, when really it was just a genetic situation that popped up, like in my case, which is an autosomal recessive gene. No one else in the immediate family, nor we knew of nobody else in our forefathers that had this certain type of disease. It's carried, I shouldn't call it disease, genetic factor that's carried by the female, the mother. And so anyway, in the rural area, I feel that we have to have training both of the parents and of the siblings and the deaf-blind person of the aware of these services, and try to reach out and in some way bring these people, if we have to, into Duluth, where they have services for the deaf-blind, or into the Minnesota deaf-blind services at Vision Loss Resources. That's one of the major needs. The other, of course, is in these times of low employment, I recognize that employers, the very few, unless they have members of their families that are deaf or blind, but not combined deaf-blind, might consider hiring these people, because in a way, communications is becoming a lot better for these deaf-blind people. They can do work with their computers. They can use a Braille keyboard, and so they're able to do some of the even like medical transferring of data onto the computer. Once the data is put on a reader that converts it to Braille or to speech, if they have enough hearing. So their needs are really, while it's more intense, is every bit the same as any other person. They can, provided given the proper support in the workplace, they could be working alongside of a non-disabled person. That's about the extent of some of the needs that I think needs to be taken care of. And I think too, with the advancement of technology, with the video phone, and the ability to be able to communicate by sign language over cameras, that much of the connections with the outside world will help in a way, so that they won't be so reclusive. They need to be out just like anybody else.
Is there anything else you would like to add?
And
Is
so,
there anything else you would like to add?
Well, I guess if I'm going to summarize, you know, you can think of the great persons, the great leaders in the past, the Churchills, the Abraham Lincoln, the presidents that we have. I mean, they can make waves and lead the people, but really, what it all boils down to, it takes the ordinary person, whether they're disabled or non-disabled, to work together as a community to put the flesh and bones into action. They may not be leaders like the presidents and so on, but certainly as ordinary people, we can all pull together and work to achieve whatever goals we have, and that will also improve the overall community.
Thank you very, very much.